Headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Can I get your take as a former Russian correspondent on the Ukraine situation? It seems sort of eerily exactly the same as when we last discussed it last Monday. All the Western leaders saying the invasion is imminent. It will happen within hours. He's mobilizing for war, and then nothing happens. How do you see it today?
Well, it's still the case that it may be so that he's doing so, but in that case, he's stark staring mad. I can't see what benefit he would gain from it. It would almost certainly bring his government down. The international reaction to an unlawful invasion of a neighbouring country would be such that it would do enormous damage to Russia and no benefit. I can't see how, if I don't doubt the Russian army is capable of gaining the ground and quite possibly of taking Kiev. But how would they hold it against a population which doesn't want them there and which would undoubtedly be helped in its resistance from outside? It's a nonsense. So if Putin is mad, then let's expect an invasion. Otherwise, you have to wonder what all this is about. What seems to me, friends of mine who know more about this than I do, say the most significant development at the moment is what looks like now the permanent stationing of Russian troops in Belarus. So Belarus is theoretical independence from Russia, which has always been quite considerable in terms of foreign policy, looks as if it may well come to an end, which means that, oddly enough, the new combination of Belarus and Russia will have a border with NATO. I'm not sure who that suits, but it's a huge development, and I think it's almost certainly been brought on by the rather bumptious and aggressive policies of Western nations, NATO, the United States and the European Union since really the early part of the century. That seems to me to be a more interesting development than the alleged invasion of Ukraine.
But of course, if Putin does roll his tanks into Ukraine, the brave people of that country, which we tend to depict as something like the Isle of Wight, as if there's about sort of 60,000 of them ready to take on the mighty bear of Russia. There's more than 40 million people live there. It's a vast country. So it isn't quite the plucky little minnow that we like to depict it as. But of course, the brave people of Ukraine are ready to defend. Even grannies who are training with guns. The BBC reported on this, and you reported on the BBC's reporting of this in your column yesterday. Tell us what you spotted that evidently the BBC didn't or decided to ignore.
Well, who knows? You'd have to ask them, and their main response to this when I asked about it was no comment. But what happened was that they showed this film. They showed a lot, actually, on the Sunday and the Monday night, I think 13th and 14th of February. One of their correspondents had been to this town of Mariupol, which is in Ukraine, but quite close to the as it were, the separatist frontier, and a place where there was serious fighting after 2014, and saw there some civilians, including a lovable old great-grandma, aged 78 or 79, depending on reports, being shown how to use a Kalashnikov. And the people showing her were members of a body called the Azov Battalion. It has other names as well, and their shoulder flashes carry a symbol called the Volstangel, which in various forms was used by many sorts of Nazi organization and indeed Nazi movement. And the Nazi movement in the Netherlands used it during the Hitler period. And it's a well-known Nazi symbol in that part of the world where people understand what these things mean. And these people are actually notorious for having very strong neo-Nazi connections. Well, another broadcasting organization called Euronews went to the same scene and managed to mention that the Azov Battalion were neo-Nazis, but the BBC somehow or other completely failed to notice and transmitted this thing as if it was just some nice soldiers giving tuition in warfare to some nice civilians. As soon as you see the neo-Nazi element of it, then you begin to wonder. My point about this is really, why does the BBC... I can't believe there's nobody in the BBC's journalism, editorial, production departments who doesn't know this. Why did they not report it? And I think they don't report it because there's this general understanding now in the reporting of the Ukraine-Russia conflict or confrontation that Russia is an evil empire like Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. and Ukraine is some kind of shining city on a hill utopia where nothing ever goes wrong. This is such complete rubbish. It's almost beyond belief to anybody who knows the area. Both Russia and Ukraine are fantastically corrupt countries. Their democracy is decidedly dodgy in both cases. The freedom of their media is equally dodgy, and they're both big messes as countries. And Ukraine undoubtedly contains a quite strong ultra-nationalist element, which has not always been as hostile to neo-Nazi ideology as you might like. And once you realize this, it ceases to be the sort of black versus white, Batman versus the Joker cartoon conflict, which most British media are portraying it as. And I think good, because people should. But that, I think, is why the BBC almost certainly did not report it, and why I thought I should raise it. Not because I think all Ukrainians are Nazis, because obviously millions of them are nothing of the kind. But because it's time that the reporting of this whole business was much more grown up. People understood it's far more complicated out there than they've been led to believe by this ludicrous, simplistic, open-mouthed reporting which we're being subjected to.
What do you think is going on at the BBC generally in terms of its journalism? Because, you know, it never ceases to remind us of its marvellous status when it comes to the best broadcasting organisation in the world that it calls itself. And yet, lately, editorially, they've made all sorts of questionable decisions. I mean, after amid the Virginia Giuffre case against Prince Andrew, they brought on as a commentator Alan Dershowitz, and neglected to mention that he was one of the people accused of benefiting from Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking business. Of course, Mr. Dershowitz denies it, but it needed to be pointed out that this man was involved in the case, and yet they didn't. Why was that?
Well, I'll pass over that. I know very little of that particular aspect of life. But necessarily, I think in the Times this morning, there's a story about the BBC getting rid of increasing numbers of experienced staff. There is a clear-out taking place. This may be one of the reasons why almost every time I listen to the so-called flagship Today programme, they try to call somebody up and they say, "Oh, terribly sorry, the line's gone wrong." They can't even ring people up at the BBC anymore and keep on the line. They keep dropping off. It's a simple thing for a broadcasting organisation, especially one funded by a gigantic £1 billion poll tax, could actually manage to make phone calls or indeed other sorts of connection and keep people on the line. They can't even do that anymore. But it's not just that. And I think there's a clear out of people at the senior level, the old style BBC people, who actually in most cases genuinely believed in the principle of impartiality. And they've been replaced by a new generation who've not been trained in that in anything like the same way, and who don't really believe in it, and who are much, much more committed to a generally leftist, radical, pro-EU, pro-green, globalist agenda, and indeed very much lined up with the sexual revolution and everything that's going on there as well. And they've just taken over. It's noticeable for me because I used to be often with grim dagger-like stares allowed into the courts of the BBC and occasionally allowed to near their microphones. And this has almost completely stopped in the past 3 or 4 years because the corporation simply is no longer prepared to put up with dissent from people of my kind. It's actually in their charter and agreement that they should do so, but they just don't want to bother. I think that a lot of people now in probably their late 50s and early 60s who upheld the older standards of the BBC, both technically and professionally, and in terms of impartiality, are leaving and being replaced by an entirely new generation of people who don't care about those things at all and frankly aren't as good at them either.
And those of us who are old enough to remember the BBC in its more traditional incarnation will know that the modern BBC bears no resemblance to what the BBC was like in the 1980s or even the 1990s. It has changed beyond recognition and not for the better.
There's another thing about this which is fascinating. You could quite a lot of BBC reporters in the era in which my mind was formed in many ways, the era of the Vietnam War in the late 60s and early 70s. Reported with obvious great strain to maintain impartiality, but they were sceptical about the claims of war. and they reported the facts about the Vietnam War and the problems of it. It seems to me, looking back on it now, as someone who was very left-wing at the time and thought the Vietnam War was a crime, and was dissatisfied with the way the BBC reported it then from a different direction. Even so, I think the reporting was far superior to the reporting of any foreign crisis we see now. Far less willing to accept the propaganda of the belligerents, far more sceptical about claims. And I think that's gone. And I think it's a great shame, because it was a vitally important part of all journalism. And I think that's in many parts of the media. It's not just the BBC. A willingness to doubt what government tells you is absolutely essential in any reporting at all. And there isn't anything like enough of that. The current reporting of the Ukraine crisis, if somebody says Putin is about to invade Ukraine, this is pretty much reported as fact.
Yeah. And as we found out, it's not fact.
Well, so far, I keep saying, I'm not saying it won't happen, because I'm not in a position, I don't know, I'm not inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, but nor is Joe Biden. Anything but, I would have thought, or indeed Alexander Pfeffel, Boris Johnson, or Liz Truss, or Liz Truss, as she's known in Russia. And they don't know what's going on in Putin's mind, but they behave as if they do. And this is what strikes me as really peculiar.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.